AskReddit by Tylo 144. For those who have careers that keep them out at sea for long periods of time, what is the creepiest thing you've seen out in the water? Some 20 years ago, on the MV Explorer, since sunk, down near the Antarctic Circle, sailing around the bergs and occasionally making landfall, we rounded into a small bay area, and there, amongst the ice and coast, was an unmarked sailing yacht. Which is odd, as generally yachts have some identifying markings on them. To add to it, they didn't respond to any radio contact, and whilst I wasn't privy to the conversation, and it was a long time ago, some crew went across via Zodiac and were refused boarding. So basically a yacht, not a particularly large one, that was unmarked, was hanging around in the inhospitable waters of the Antarctic and didn't want any help or contact. Proper weird. This one threw me for a loop, as I had a friend who did semester at sea on the MV Explorer, but thankfully different ships. Not creepy, but totally weird. Two Chinese boats, like small, old, fishing vessels, meeting up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean like half a mile behind us. This was so random, within international waters but so freaking far away from China. I still wonder what the hell they were doing there. They had no AIS. The first one to arrive close by, passed next to us as if to check who we were and if we were keeping course, sailing vessel, and then went straight towards the other ship and mated. Maybe drug trafficking or maybe just fishing. But yeah, still pretty far away from their most likely official harbor and kind of weird. It was literally in the middle of the pond, around 10 degrees north of the equator, so not your typical fishing route. Those are spies. When I was in the Navy, we'd get followed by the nastiest, rustiest, most rundown and covered in bird shit fishing boats you've ever seen. Until you look closer and notice all the antennae. And if you doubt my story, well, https://www.telegraph.co.uk/news/2021/005/China's-fishing-fleet-made-front-spying-operation/ I used to be an oil field diver in the Gulf of Mexico. I'd say about 80% of the dives I logged were at night. Mostly 500 feet and under DSVs. It's very eerie feeling sitting on the downline doing in water decompression in the middle of night. I'd always ask topside to turn off my headlight. Like a worm on a hook. Just bobbing in the darkness. Now that's spooky. You ever have anything bump into you in the pitch black? Somewhere in the Atlantic, nice cold as fuck night, decided to step out and look at stars. About 10 minutes on and a boat's mast pops up, sits there a few minutes and then back under. No alarms, nothing. Just some sub boys getting a bit of late night O2 in the middle of nowhere next to some friends. I think people underappreciated how chilling it must be to have a sub under near you. I've been in a boat in areas they are known to be present, generally speaking, and just looking into the water thinking of it under there freaks me the fuck out. Not sure why, just some folks doing their job. Those vessels are terrifying though. I am a recreational sailor who travels for weeks at a time at sea. I once saw a flame on the water not 10 yards from me. Just freaking burning at midnight. Ocean fires are a rare phenomenon that occur when flammable gases seep out of the seafloor and ignite upon contact with oxygen in the water. These fires are not a new discovery, as they have been documented for centuries. Surely weird as fuck though. This sort of qualifies. Former Navy here. Somewhere off the coast of Italy saw a very, very small boat, not much bigger than a rowboat, about 9 or 10 miles offshore. This was sometime around midnight. There was no light from land, and no other ships around. It had a light. Our ship captain said it was a fisherman, and the fish would be attracted to the light at that time. Imagine being in a rowboat about 10 miles offshore in the middle of a pitch black night, waiting to see what finds you. That fisherman has no fear. In 20 years the weirdest shit I've seen is other people that work out here. There's about 40% of the sailors like what they do and are good at it. Another 40% that are good at it, but would do something better if the money was right. But there's another 20%. If they lived ashore for more than 6 months a year they'd end up dead or incarcerated. There's no more west for them to go to, so they went offshore and became our problem. Love that turn of phrase, there's no more west for them. I've known some seamen and get exactly what you mean. Literally drifted and or were chased straight off the continents. A dead human body. It was the tropics and it wasn't in good shape. We turned it over to the authorities at nearest land. There were enough teeth left to identify it by dental records. Here's hoping the man's family got closure. Edit. Troll 2010 is correct. The body was double bagged and stored in the walk-in freezer until our next port visit. There was quite a bit of cleaning and decontamination involved, but that's the gist of it. I had that happen to me while surfing. Me and a few others were sitting at a point break when a body just floats around the rocky point and right into us. He had drowned about 3 days prior, so it wasn't pretty. Not so much creepy as eerie, but being out in the blue at night in a lightning storm and a slack wind. The ocean was very flat, no big rolling swells, just tiny little ripples. The whole world would be black, and then there would be a flurry of bolts, and the whole world would be silver. The ocean looked like nothing so much as aluminium foil that had been scrunched up and flattened out. The water looked like mercury, and all the little ripples made these very dramatic black shadows. I enjoy your evocative writing style. What I'm learning from these comments is that the ocean makes people poets. Legit some of the most evocative and beautiful writing I've seen in Reddit in quite some time in this post. Creepiest thing I've seen has definitely been seeing myself and other crewmates lose our minds. On one particularly awful voyage, everything that could go wrong went wrong and we found ourselves without food, water, and sleep for a very unhealthy amount of time. It started off with auditory hallucinations. Ships are noisy, and when you're going crazy, you begin to think those noises are talking to you. I heard children laughing, a choir singing, and creepiest of all, a particular splash sounded like it was calling my name from the sea. Combine that with visual hallucinations and then things get really terrifying. I was convinced we were in the desert at one point with sand all around us and mountains in the distance. Another crew member freaked out and told us we were about to run into an apartment building. The creepiest thing I saw was an all-black flying pig with red eyes on the bow. I think the scariest though was when someone was convinced we lost part of our crew overboard. Capital I. Other than that, there was this one time I saw 3 gigantic ships in the distance with no lights and they did not show up on AIS. Suddenly they were gone. It was extremely creepy. Were you an old-timey pirate? This sounds intense. I was drinking in an airport bar and met a woman who worked as a commercial fisherman, on her way to Asia for R&amp, with her family. Real salt of the earth lady. She regaled me with stories about her work, all the good stuff about working in her world, all the reasons she kept doing it for decades. I asked her what the scariest thing she saw out on the open ocean was and, without any hesitation, she said, "Oh, an underwater UFO. I saw one rise up out of the ocean next to my boat and fly off into the sky." The matter-of-factness of her answer bothers me to this day. UAPs are often associated with water and often appear in this way according to United States officials. There are tons of stories like this. Super weird. Not exactly in the water but body parts in a sea chest. The sea chest is a hole in the hull which is used for water intake. Pirate booty? Years ago my friends and I visited Thailand, and went on several excursions on a boat with a captain. On one of the evenings we were out at night and it was pitch black except for the green lights that were coming from the large commercial fishing boats way out in the distance. We had stopped for a while to take in the view and eat, when it started to rain. The captain thought it was best to head back, and then quickly realized that the boat propeller wasn't working and something was caught on it. He grabbed his head-mounted flashlight and a knife and jumped in the water. He was gone for a good minute, which felt like eternity as we were huddled around trying to figure out what was happening. Fear started kicking in as we waited. Then he suddenly re-emerged panting and told us that shortly after he jumped in, he lost his flashlight and had to literally feel his way underwater towards the propeller, reaching and cutting a plastic tarp that had wound itself around the propeller, cut it loose, and made his way back to the surface in the dark. It was a strange set of emotions as we were completely impressed with the badass display we just witnessed, relieved he made it back but also freaked out imagining what would have happened if he hadn't. One night on the 0004 watch in the Persian Gulf on a military transport, the whole sky went from pitch black of 0200 to fully lit in a second. This went on for about 30 seconds, then back to pitch black. We called up the neighboring ships and HQ, no one knew what happened. Our best guess was a meteor. Second story was a couple years before the first, cruising around the Philippines and see nothing at all visual and on radar. All of a sudden we see a faint white light about 100 yards off our port bow. Typically we don't let anything get within a mile of our ship. Grab the binnacle and head to the bridge wing and there is just a little banker boat with his outboard motor and a flashlight. Even with radar, NVGs and an infrared camera we couldn't see this guy's little 20-foot boat in a 6-foot sea without lights on. Obviously more crazy stuff than creepy in my career so far. The people are the craziest thing you will experience at sea. Had one guy who wouldn't go outside the skin of the ship at night because the aliens would abduct him, again. Anything to report from the overnight watch? All pretty routine, sir. We nearly hit a rowing boat, night turned into day for 30 seconds and Jeff was abducted by aliens again. I was on a 32-foot speedboat and got caught by nightfall in between islands. No night lights on the boat, navigating using GPS and depth finder. Captain knew the way like the back of his hand since he'd sailed those waters since he was a kid, but for me it was my first time in the middle of the ocean at night. Pitch black but for the stars. As above so below, it seemed as if the boat was floating in the blackest void of the universe. Years later I saw the movie Life of Pi and the scene where Pi is in his lifeboat floating in the dark among the stars, no above no below. It was exactly like that. I still have dreams about that night. The engulfing dark and the silence that was not silent. Surreal. We made it safely to port. Captain fitted the night lights on that boat the day after. Some people will never experience what no light pollution is like. There are so many stars. Although the sound of water smashing against the ship is terrifying. I have a friend who works on ships. He said the single scariest thing he had ever seen was looking out a window and seeing a wave that he said looked like it was 100 meters high pass right by their boat and suddenly disappear. He knew about rogue waves, but he said seeing one that big and that close and watching it suddenly just vanish was so creepy and shocking that he was literally stunned for a minute. What's funny is that rogue waves weren't even really confirmed by the scientific community until the later half of the 20th century. People just disappeared. I was underway from the port of Houston to Cartagena, Colombia. The vessel cuts all lights off on the outside of the boat, so it's pretty dark outside. I would always go and sit out on the deck and listen to my headphones and look at the stars. Well, one night, somewhere in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, I noticed a swarm of lightning bugs cross the boat. Totally blew my mind to see light out of nowhere. At least I think it was lightning bugs. On the same trip heading back to Houston from Colombia, I witnessed a satellite crashing. At least, that's what I think it was. It steadily strobed and lit up the night sky and water for about 15 minutes till I couldn't see it anymore. And on a different trip, I was in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. No moon, no clouds, no light pollution. The amount of stars that I saw made me cry. Never thought starlight alone could cast a shadow. Definitely mesmerizing. I still remember it like it was yesterday. Sitting out on deck in the dark somewhere out around Cat Island, I reckon, anchored. All the stars reflected back on the still waters and we were surrounded by such interminable beauty. I never knew the world could be so peaceful and wondrous. It was 1998. I was only 11, was out for a quick boat ride with some family. Swiss Air Flight 111 had recently crashed a bay or two away. We saw a suitcase floating from afar. My dad quickly turned the boat back to shore. I was once deployed to a Taiwanese high seas drift net vessel as a fisher's observer. The vessel I was placed on would deploy their net and the crew would then seek a few hours sleep. They usually got no more than 5 or so hours when actively fishing. Often, though, the captain would stay up and hand jig for squid, which he dried and packed away. One night, however, I got up to take a leak and no one was awake. We were 1,500 miles from the nearest land, about equidistant between Midway and the Aleutians. The waters were calm and the moon lit the sea under a partly cloudy sky. I went out to the rail and began pissing overboard. The ship began to rock. It was moments before I realized that a monstrous fucking container ship was passing to our stern by less than 100 yards. The ship was so large it covered my whole field of view. To this day I wonder if someone aboard that vessel had been. Sometimes, during nighttime I have went out of the accommodation, leaving compartment on boat merchant ships, to breathe some fresh air or to take out the trash since the garbage station was outside. And when it is completely dark, and the water is calm, you hear the splashing water against the ship's hull. Well, I can't explain why, but the ocean water was luring me, but at the same time you are terrified, since nobody will find you if you fall overboard. So sometimes I was just staring at the water in the dark, and inside me was some struggle, like some part of me wanted to jump in, while the other was terrified that it would be a one-way ticket. Can't still find the explanation for this. This hypnotic, mesmerizing feeling I get, and at the same time the chills running down my spine, that if I would fall in the water, it's game over for sure. Must be the mermaid's whispers. A man swimming alone in the Java Sea. He had been floating for a couple of days and although several boats had passed him he didn't dare hail a ship not from Indonesia because he feared being taken as a slave or something. It's possible he was a little mad but he did seem happy to have us turn up. A toilet. I mean a literal regular household toilet floating hundreds of miles from land. And why was it floating? I'll never know. New breed of anglerfish. Forman AV. The Indian Ocean is absolutely infested with sharks. You see nothing but dorsal fins extending all the way into the horizon. Somewhere there's a shark moaning to his mate about how his patch of ocean has become infested with bloody warships. An empty sailboat with no mast, 300 miles from land. Probably a giant squid, well in excess of 10 m as a conservative estimate. Clinging to the bow and hull of our emergency escape vessel which was hanging a few meters out of the water, and a few meters below where I was stood. In the depths of night while I nipped out for a sneaky smoke, and I happened to look down at the rescue boat and could see the shadow didn't look right in the moonlight. Stupidly I used my phone torch, big no-no when it's dock and ship, and scared the crap out of myself. The vessel it was wrapped around is about 15 m long. And its tentacles were wrapped up over the gunnels 2/3 of the way down the sides. Within seconds it had detached and fell back into the ocean. I can still picture its eyeball, the size of a football, staring right at me before it dropped into the ocean. It still gives me chills now. I was in the USN back in the late 80s early 90s. Cruising through the Indian Ocean in 100% blackness, then waking up the next afternoon and looking over the rails and seeing hundreds of sharks swimming alongside of us constantly. Every now and then we would get a man overboard alert. They never recovered even one of them at night. They were usually suicides. I read another comment from a former sailor talking about man overboard drills using a 55-gallon drum painted orange. And how even in the daytime the recovery rate was horrifyingly low, like 30%. Two things. First was the amount of stars you can see from the middle of the Atlantic. Had a girlfriend with me and we would talk while watching shooting stars. I swear some of them were just moving and not shooting, but who really knows? Gave me the sense that humans are really just egotistical ants in the universe. Second was when the ocean was smooth as glass. When I walked out the skin of ship, I silently gasped because I was really scared. The calmness of it all and the lack of distinction of the horizon was terrifying. I went back in the skin of the ship out of fear, then came back out about 10 minutes later and just breathed. The most terrifyingly amazing aspect of the calmness was seeing the details of the clouds in the ocean, then the occasional ripple. Felt like I had crossed dimensions into a heaven I was not supposed to see. Submarine sailor. Nothing creepy, but some of my best memories are sitting on top of the sail smoking a cigarette in the pitch black under the stars. Scary. We had an electrical fire in the engine room one time. Another time during a scram exercise we flooded the diesel. Scary. Edit. Just remembered one of the worst memories. We were on patrol, underwater, for an extended period of time. I'm talking weeks and weeks and weeks without fresh air. We had completed our mission and were heading into port. I went up the sail to get in a smoke, almost immediately after we had it rigged. Climbing back down afterwards, the smell that filled my nostrils. 175 men who had limited their hygiene routine for many weeks. And ass. It was downright putrid. Since we were surfaced, we ventilated and only the three of us got to experience it. The thought of being submerged thousands of feet under the ocean, hundreds of miles from land in a big metal tube, scares the absolute shit out of me. You have huge brass balls, so floes of ice passing by, covered in blood. Then I remember that polar bears exist. Legitimately though, calm water and flat light. You can't see where the sea and sky split. It's really dangerous for helicopters and generally unsettling. Nothing too out of the ordinary, but two things stick out to me. On occasion, I have to get in the water in the middle of the ocean for man overboard drills. Looking down and seeing literally nothing is actually a little eerie when I think about it. Seeing storm systems develop in the distance is pretty cool and trippy at the same time. You'll literally see massive storm clouds developing a waterspout, although they seldom fully develop, and lightning light up the horizon. It's especially powerful at night to the point where all you see is white light. Other than that, it's just occasional marine life. My job is mundane, but it has its moments. Husband used to crayfish out on the Bass Strait of water between Tasmania and mainland Australia. Most interesting thing he saw was within 15 meters of the boat, a shark jumped out of the water with a seal in its mouth and ripped it to shreds. He said it was like watching the Discovery Channel. Not a job, but I've been scuba diving in the dark before. There was a moment where I strayed a little too far from the lights and lost where the surface was. The dimly lit void all around me, nothing but tiny bubbles and particles drifting through beam of my little torch. It almost felt as if I was asleep, or like nothing existed but me and the nothingness. There was a definite dream-like quality to the experience, probably because I was floating. It was beautiful. Of course, I imagine it was a little like being in space, but also the terror of being somewhere you did not belong. A medium that your body was not made to exist in, is a very sharp feeling. The realization that if I kept swimming in the wrong direction my life could actually be in danger probably wouldn't have occurred to me if I hadn't been trained on what to do in this exact scenario. It's pretty easy to panic in that position. I eventually managed to orient myself with the bubbles from my mask, and it turned out I wasn't that far from the surface lol. When I got back up I realized I was a lot further from the boat than I thought, though. Swam the whole way back less than a meter down. The time between me realizing I was lost to me reaching open air was probably less than a minute, but it felt like eternity. I think anyone who has been in the ocean at night would agree it's a different world out there. USN sailor. I have seen a lot of remarkable things, but the creepiest was a great white shark that swam, more like drifted, in between the two ships during an underway replenishment off the coast of Australia. I could make an educated guess on how big it was, but just let me tell you it was way bigger than the biggest sharks I've seen on the Shark Week shows. Much longer and twice as massive as the biggest shark ever seen on the YouTube videos I've seen. It didn't move a single inch, it just floated, mouth open, In between us, everyone on the bridge viewing exclaimed, "Holy fucking shit, its teeth were as big as a man's head. And it had massive scars down its back and tail from a ship's propeller. I wouldn't have believed it if I didn't see it with my own eyes." Sounds like one rural hospital long. Not seen, but heard. I was a sonar tech on a Los Angeles class submarine for 4 years. There are sounds out there that not even the saltiest, most experienced acoustic intelligence dudes could identify. I like to imagine they were the ancient ones rolling over in their sleep. Or some alien technology powering up. I worked on a commercial fishing boat in Alaska one summer. I got up one early morning before sunrise because I heard what sounded like a woman moaning not far from the boat. We were probably a few miles off the coast near Bristol Bay. It was really creepy. The captain said it was seals. Shortly after that, a massive storm blew in. Oh hey, one I can actually answer. So this isn't the creepiest story, I'll admit that straight off. I was working on a tiny oil rig off the Gulf Coast. It was about 2 PM. I was on what was called sliver duty. Basically, you wait in between two relatively close together walls on the exterior of the rig, strapped into a safety harness, while someone skirts through a long flow cable that you direct. Boring, but you get a nice view of the ocean for an hour or two. Suddenly my buddy on the other end of the sliver starts screaming to look down. I do, and saw the biggest sea creature I'd ever seen in my life. End to end, it must have been the size of most rural hospitals I've seen. Just pushing below the surface of the water, it raised its head out and I realized I was really dumb and was staring at an undersea cable placer. My uncle was a tech diver for rigs out in the Gulf. He said shit gets real weird deep underwater. I don't think I'll ever get used to how dark it can get. On moonless nights, calm seas can be a bit hypnotic. Drunk U-boat captain ran into unmanned oil platform 20 miles away. Lit up the sky like the sun was rising, but at 2 AM. Saw a really large whale. I swear it looked me straight in my face like it knew I was human. As much as I knew it was a whale. I remember I sort of just let out a small wow. And the whale just looked at me. About a 12-15 foot tiger shark. A friend told me this. He was a competitive endurance rower, rowing across the Atlantic. It was night and his little boat was floating right in the middle passage where many slave ships sailed hundreds of years ago. It was an extremely calm sea with no wind. He swears he could hear voices whispering in a language he did not understand. He also mentioned being in high seas at another point, and he could look up into the waves above his head and see shark silhouettes. I like being on land. They made a documentary about the race. https://www.pbs.org/video/directors-cut-tom-mile-hot-row-hard-no-excuses/ I live on the North Sea and I've heard the voices thing. Not sure if it's certain tones created by the winds that trick the mind into hearing voices, but it's definitely eerie. I saw someone pick up their half-eaten Snickers bar off a deck rise next to the toilet in the head of combat systems berthing and keep eating it. That head flooded with CHT, black water aka poop, at least once a week because the sounding and security watch would go to sleep instead of responding to the tank full alarm and pressing the button to pump it out. What was the availability of getting another Snickers? Reefs in the middle of nowhere. You can anchor and see everything, but they don't get above sea level, so looking from the horizon, nothing's there. Sea of Thieves does this sort of thing really well for a video game. It's always hilarious seeing newer pirates get their ships absolutely stuck on the occasional reef and long, shallow beaches. I imagine it's terrifying in reality because you really can't see shit until you're basically right on top of it. Former commercial fisherman. One morning we had a Russian submarine surface about a quarter mile off the stern with its periscope fully raised. We had a marine biologist from the state as an observer, and I'll never forget him saying, "Is that a goddamn submarine?" We were drinking coffee early in the morning when this happened, and the captain kinda just pretended it wasn't there. Didn't call it in on the radio or anything. In fact, we assumed it was an American sub as we were near a US Navy base. Coast Guard showed up and started trying to hail the sub via the radio, which the captain had left on an emergency channel to listen in. I'll never forget our faces as we hear Russian submarine Victor Leonov, please respond. Glad I didn't read the first bit properly and thought you were talking about a submarine. The payoff was great when I read the last line. I've always found the dark of night eerie with a jet black sky and a somehow darker ocean waving by. It completely removed your frame of reference. As a former miner who found the true darkness of the underground somewhat meditative when I occasionally turned off my headlamp, I weirdly never got used to the void of the dark ocean at night. However, the eeriest thing that happened is that over the series of 3 days, several blackbirds hit the side of the ship and then died in the crates below. I would reach into a crate for some piece of equipment and pull out a rigid little black body. The birds don't bleed, they seem to just die. I couldn't help but take it as a bad omen, however nothing did happen and birds are known to gravitate toward ships. One day during the same voyage, I reached into a crate and felt the wriggle of a live body and pulled out a live, but shook up, little blackbird. We let it rest on the ship and gave it space until it was ready to take off. Even though I've seen some other objectively worse things in my career, for some reason the birds just stick with me and I find myself thinking about all those little birds often. Back when I was a cadet at a merchant ship, I used to be exhausted and overworked all the time that I started hallucinating stuff at night. My watch used to start at 4 in the morning. One fine day we hit a storm and the wind was coming with such a force that it was creating a wailing sound like somebody is crying outside. I went to check outside and saw a shadowy figure sitting at the corner. I knew I was hallucinating, but still I shat my pants. Never went outside during a storm after that. Fast darting white lights in the middle of the night. They moved very erratically then stayed still, like drones, but very far away and seemingly too fast. Moved in straight lines too, never diagonal. We were at least 300 nm from land. Pack. This question gets reposted every year and it's always a solid thread. You never see the same answers and it's always a great thread to scroll through. Not me, my dad in Nam was on an aircraft carrier. He said they were on the nets hanging off the side getting sun. A plane comes into land and they stand up with their heads above deck to watch the plane land. As the plane comes in, the stop cable breaks and amp. In a second it snaps his friend's head clean off, perched about a foot from him. Head goes flying like a football into the water, body drop into the net. Dad said they stopped the ship to attempt to find the head, but zero chance. More of a courtesy.